Oh, I have a fun fact.
Hi, welcome back to Massenet. This week we're going to be talking about the movie Pickup on South Street that was directed by Samuel Fuller, and it's from the year 1953. It's about this woman named Candy who gets her purse pickpocketed by this man, Skip McCoy, and unbeknownst to her, inside of her purse was a microfilm, and this sets Candy and Skip into a series of convoluted events with some communist spies, one of which happens to be Candy's ex-boyfriend, Joe. So this week we're going to be talking about the political messages that Fuller may have been sending through this movie. All right, does anyone want to kick off the discussion?
I think the sort of what we can focus on first to begin is this one quote that Fuller made about the film, where he said that he never set out with this film to make it, explicitly political. He just wanted to make a film about people on the margins, which I personally find interesting, because I'm of the very pretentious opinion that every piece of art is political. Even if an artist and director, etc., is saying, oh, I made this with no politics in mind, it's very interesting to then look at that work of art and see what they consider apolitical and what they consider without politics. So I do think that looking at that quote and saying, this, I never made this movie with the intent to be political, and then seeing, what was then included in that, we can sort of then, I guess, extract, ironically, his politics from that, and sort of what's not explicitly stated, but what seems to be, what characters are valued, what characters are given happy endings, what's sort of what's portrayed in a positive or negative light, who is sympathetic and who is unsympathetic, things like that are what can be really revealing about a film and a director's politics.
I think also he he included the communism aspect of society that communism has always been a political controversy, and it caused kids to have to do bomb raid practice in school. Clearly communism is a big political thing, especially in the 40s and from then till the 90s. So to incorporate communism so much into your film and then go, but it's not political, is, I think it's a big FU to the
it's a point of
critics
to
just
be oh, this doesn't matter, I'm just putting it in the film,
yeah,
and sort of, and then the communists that we see are functionally the antagonists of this film, because we've got the one, the most prominent one is Candy's ex-boyfriend, who beats her. He's very violent with her, and he's sort of he's part of this sort of little cabal of communists that the police are trying to stop, and that Skip is trying to stop, to help Candy out, to save her. And but this whole time they're basically trying to what's on the microfilm is information about the atomic bomb, some nuclear information, and they're trying to get that from the US government to the Soviet government. So it's sort of the communist presentation we have in this film are explicitly committing acts of treason. And the good guys, the protagonists, are the ones who are trying to stop.
And also, this film was released
happening
in 1953, and that was after the nuclear bombs.
I think this movie, even though it was after World War II, it's very much a war film, because right after World War II, we were catapulted into the Red Scare and McCarthyism, where McCarthy was just blindly pointing at people and saying, you're a communist, you're a communist. And I think that actually happens a lot in this movie, when Candy goes to retrieve the microfilm from Skip, and immediately Skip is she's trying to steal something from me, she's bad, equals communism, so she's a communist. So every time someone doesn't like someone in this movie, their insult is, you're a commie. So I think that's really interesting, is that even though this isn't a gory in a battlefield war film, this is still a war film, if that makes sense.
I think it does kind of show what the war was like at home for Americans. Yeah. And especially the Red Scare, that whole time, what it was at home, and from a not people in power position. Because when you see these things, a lot of time when you see stuff that's taken place during the Red Scare, you see a lot of government officials depicted, what they're going they were like, we gotta battle the Russians and the Soviets, and it's like you're seeing people at home and like they've become so ingrained with media fear that they're now, it's like, especially McCarthyism, they're just like, commie, you bad. Exactly. And so it's like you're seeing it from a very like layman's terms, like what people viewed communism as and how they treated it on like the surface level in America.
We see, like the microfilm, which is the official government document, but we never really see who made it, like which like lab or whatever it was stolen from. It's all about the effect that this official piece of, like intel has on ordinary people, and sort of, like how it's almost like this, I don't know, it almost makes you a leper, like even being associated with it or even touching it. Because I think like a big thing, like a big point of contention in the film is sort of, like who knows about the film, who actually knows what they were stealing, who knows what's on it. Because it's sort of like the threat there is basically, like if that's basically, I think about like the scene where Candy, like after she knocks Skip out in his little shack on the water, and she, like takes the film and she goes to police, she, like makes a point of emphasizing that she's the only one who knew what was on the film, and she's the only one who knew, like the full weight of what was being stolen, because she understands that like if the police know that Skip knew what was on the film, that he would become implicated, and he would, like, since he's, like, what was the term called, like a 3-time loser or something like that.
Yeah.
But like this would be the charge that would send him away. And like even if he like legitimately had nothing to do with the film, he was not planning on like turning it over to the communists at all. Just him being associated with it, and like the threat of like, about this could be enough to fuck him over.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting how like Skip is the twice convicted like criminal. He's the one who like has a rapport with the police because he's like been arrested so many times. But once, the fight against the communists comes up, Skip is now the protagonist, other than like the woman beating, lives in a dock like criminal that he previously was. Now he's on the good side because of this kind of like blind nationalism that occurs pretty much every time America goes into a war, and we're like, America first, and we gotta fight the enemy, when like they really kind of don't understand. But I'm gonna go on a communist rant, but but I think that's like kind of interesting how like Skip was like thrown into the position of hero because suddenly he was faced with like, now we have to fight the communists, and that kind of nationalism shines through in that part of the film.
I mean,
it's kind of, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I just think also like after World War I, there was a lot of disillusionment with being an American, and a lot of people fled to Europe. And I think after World War II, I think the Red Scare kind of united America again.
Yeah,
was having like another wave of that disillusionment and people leaving. So I think that's kind of a depiction of that, is like even like the criminals, like the worst of society, are still on America's side.
Yeah,
because the communists are just that bad. I think like I don't know like what exactly to phrase that as, but I think that's very important that they showed it. And I think that has to be a political statement, is that like even like the lowest of the low, like a 3-time loser, still is on America's side, still hates the commies. Like, You know what I mean? Like, it's like the only thing that could show him different is if he murdered someone besides Joe. But there had to be that distinction that Joe is a commie and he murdered somebody. Skip is an American and believes in capitalism, and he didn't kill anybody.
Even though he steals.
I was gonna say, even though he really steals.
It is, and it's sort of like, it's through this whole plot of like, getting the film back and sort of like begrudgingly working with the police, because he doesn't, they're on the same side, but he never explicitly collaborates with them, but he does in the end help them. And it's kind of through this that he gets sort of like a bit of like a form of redemption almost, because, because of his help, like getting back the film and beating up, Joe the communist on the subway train, on the subway tracks, which that scene, by the way, I was convinced one of them was going to get run over.
I know.
Very surprised when neither of them did. I think sort of like I think just like the ending that the film gave to Skip and to Candy is sort of like in itself like a bit of like a political statement of sort of, like, because, like, Skip is this pickpocket, this sort of like outlaw, sort of, like lives life very rough. And then like Candy is someone who like, again, is also associated with that kind of life. I think like, am I the only one that like got kind of like hints that she like was maybe suggested to be like some form of like sex worker
Yeah, she was
or
a
something.
prostitute.
Like was that
Yeah. Also, that's kind of why the actress sorry, this was part of my fun fact for later, but I want to share. Part of the reason why that Jean Peters got casted, because originally the director didn't like her, was because he saw her walk and she kind of walked bow-legged, like how a lot of like quote prostitutes walked at the time. And
wow.
so he was like, you walk like a sex worker. You shall be my actress.
Oh, God.
Yeah,
But
that was in the
Yeah.
beginning too, when she was like on the train and she was like looking at Skip in like a super sensual way. That's what I got to.
Yeah, and sort of like the step that the film goes of like, these are the two people that will allow, you know, like to get out alive, and they're sort of, you know, like they're still on like very like, you know, on thin ice with the cops, but there's sort of like this like smugness in the final scene where, you know, like Candy tells the police officer Tiger, she's like, oh yeah, you know, bet on it that he's gonna be back in here. It's sort of like the film kind of like lets them get away and lets them be okay, and I think that's sort of like, I don't know, that's pretty big, of sort of like letting these types of people and like these types of characters who live on the margins to have sort of like that nice resolution, to sort of like have a bit of peace.
How does everyone feel? Like, do we think Skip's gonna go back to being a pickpocket?
I
Like,
feel like yes.
Or do
Ingrained in him.
yeah.
I don't think he's gonna stop.
Yeah.
I don't know, from the ending scene I got that like I don't know, he was leaving like the office, so like, yeah, I didn't do anything, you know, like that, and like I'm getting away with this, and
Yeah.
I was like, yes, he's just gonna continue to do
Yeah.
it.
Klepto tendencies seem too strong and for him to stop.
Like he didn't seem very
Like
like
him and Candy are gonna do it together, kind of.
Yeah,
I
like
got-
an anti-hero type thing.
She's like, I'll be his alibi.
yeah.
Exactly. I want to talk more about what Daphne said about like marginal people, but before I forget, I actually wrote down this one line regarding to that whole like, let's unite against the communist thing that Mo said right before she died. And Joe has a gun to her, and she goes, you know, the one thing I know about commies is that I just don't like them. So like the American people were united by this like one problem, like the communists, the Red Scare. And then like Mo just like encapsulated that in that one line where she was like, I don't know anything about communism. I don't know what communism is, but like all I know is that I'm not supposed to like them, so I don't. So
yeah, sort of like at the same time that you're like very actively suffering from capitalism, because this woman literally cannot even
exactly.
afford to
That's what I wanted
die.
to.
She cannot
That's what
afford
I
to
wanted
have
to
a funeral.
context with like marginal people, because like I think the three protagonists of the film, if you don't count the police, are in marginalized groups. Like Candy is an ex-prostitute, therefore she has that social stigma, and then you have Skip, who is a pickpocket and like a twice offender, and then Mo, who is just like doing whatever she can to keep her head afloat in a like a communist society. Like I think it's so funny how this film is like condemning communism so vehemently, but then it shows its main and most kind of sympathetic character crippled under the effects of capitalism. Like she says this one line where like, I'm so tired, I'm just living so that I can afford to die. So I think that's just like interesting. Anna, I'm sorry, you were gonna say something.
Sorry. I think that like the director, maybe he's saying that there's no good form of government. Like maybe this is an anarchist film.
Yeah. I think that Sam Fuller was an anarchist based on like what I got from this film.
And like he has to be, because he's not showing either one in a good, and he's not showing a good solution. He's not like socialism. He's like, all these suck. We should just live in the woods.
I mean, like, it is common knowledge that there's no one who hates leftists more than other leftists. Like, the amount of infighting in the left, like, the liberals hate leftists, communists hate anarchists, like, all of this stuff. So I think it's very possible that Fuller was left-leaning, but he, like, didn't really, but he didn't agree, you know, like, with probably, like, you know, communists and socialists, and he thought he like, maybe supported, like, his own brand of leftism. Just, you know, like that could have been a possibility.
Not even like personal philosophies, but just I'm going to say this. I don't think anyone that's actually educated on their party agrees 100% with their party, because otherwise, like, you're brainwashed, I think, in my personal opinion. So I think this is a very, like, I think he was exposing a lot of things in this film versus being like, hey, I'm going to brainwash you into agreeing with something. Like, I think a lot of films at the time when they addressed communism, it was like kind of trying to brainwash their audience into hating communism. It's like without giving like, concrete examples, kind of like how Mo didn't know anything about communism, just hated it. I think for him, he wasn't brainwashing, he is exposing.
Yeah.
Because it's not like the communists are the only ones that are shown in a negative light, because we do see, they're definitely shown like very sinister, like you've got Joe and like his two other communists that are like, out there hiding out in hotels, killing police officers and all this stuff. But at the same time, the police themselves aren't shown in a very sympathetic light either, like Tiger and then the other investigator who's working with him. They're kind of like, they're almost shown as like, like quota counters of like people who are keeping track of, like all of the pickpockets on the street. Like when Mo, like is killed, like they basically bring in like everyone she has in her contacts in her book. So they kind of like they use her, they sort of like they let those guys be there, then they call them in the minute that like they could possibly make an arrest or they could possibly make a conviction. And like so like they're there sort of like as like not necessarily as an antagonistic force, but definitely as this sort of like as this threat to like the true protagonists of the film. So it's a critique of them as much as it is communism bad.
I think it's also I just kind of thought about this, like you have like your two like supposedly protagonists, which are Candy and Skip, and they have like these like nicknames, and obviously Candy, we would now connotate that with like like a stripper name or something. It's like what I thought when I first started. I was like, because we've had I think we had like a Lois or an Elaine or like an Ellen, like we've had like these like classic names, and there's Candy, which I think at the time she would be seen as like trashy for having that name. And you have Skip, which sounds like a little kid's name, but then your communist is Joseph, like Stalin, but it's like an actual name versus giving like your like protagonist like these like nicknames or like names with like negative connotations. And I don't know, again, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I think it's interesting that instead of giving like the protagonist like these like like really like well-to-do names, they're given like Skip and Candy.
Yeah, it's kind of
and
like, it's kind of like putting the cops in like their situation of like power and like strong, whereas like these people of like lower class or like I don't know, I can see that represented through names.
And then like additionally
name
you
is
have
literally Tiger. Like his name is literally Tiger. So.
Yeah, literally.
Sort of like he's like hunting down sort of like a like predator, and then like the criminals are the prey. And then like additionally Mo as well sort of like has that sort of like very unconventional name for a woman at the time. Like when I remember like the scene when Skip goes up to pick up her coffin, like just before she's transported to Powers Field, when he comes to pick her up and he mentions her name, the like the people who are ferrying the boat initially assume that he's there to pick up a man. And he's like, actually no, she. So like additionally there, that's sort of like people on the margins with the like even their names are very unconventional and very outside of the mainstream.
Checked, his name is actually Captain Dan Tiger, like legit Tiger. I thought Mo was flirting with him at first when she called him Tiger. I was like, oh, get him, girl. No, turns out that's his name.
No, his name's Tiger. Yep. Like one of Mo's cats.
Yeah, I didn't pick that up.
Oh god, I legit like I would have believed that it was just like an epithet or a nickname, because like it would have been a very noir thing to do,
Mo does speak in like
Tiger
metaphors though. Mo's very much like she refers to like her plot of land where she wants to be buried as like her cat, and then she's like,
as a kitty
for my kitty. But God, Mo's like whole existence is just like so anti-capitalistic. I think it's so kind of like ironic that like a 1950s movie.
Mo is the only like pure character in this.
No, she is. She's like so sympathetic to the like you like connect with her. Like in that one scene where Joe is about to kill her and she's in her and she's like, I am just so tired. And it's just like this kind of like, and the camera's zooming in on her and you're just getting more and more intimate with like this character, and you're realizing like, she's a really bad person. Like sure, she's like in the entangled with this whole all the pickpocketers and she has everybody's name, but like she's really just trying to do what she can to survive under like a capitalistic economy where she has to like, where her and Skip and Candy actually have to like kind of do whatever they can, even if it's kind of morally depraved, in order to keep their heads afloat. So God, hearts.
Also fit into the noir thing of the protagonist not being 100% sympathetic, but it also still gives you a sympathetic character to have Mo, because all Mo's done is victimized by society and about like by like capitalism and by money and just like her social status. And then at the end when she gets murdered, that's like the highest form of victimization in my mind. And then so even though like the protagonists of Skip and Candy aren't completely like pure, there's Mo, and so Mo stands for like the victims of the society and the politics and all that jazz.
Yeah, like when Mo died.
Like noir,
sorry, yeah.
I feel like noir a lot of the time uses like side characters to do that, you know, like it has very like stereotypical main characters that you kind of know what to expect, but then it has like these side characters that the audience can like fall back on in a way.
Yeah, exactly. When she died, I was like, I wrote down in my like it was like poetic kind of, like she was working her entire life and everything she did was to kind of like cheat this like quote unquote fate that like she was going to be, you know, doomed to end up in this cemetery where she wanted to go to this private cemetery. And then she, you know, she kind of accepted that that was her role in the world right before she died. Like, I don't know how to like describe that. It's like poetically existential kind of.
Yeah,
that,
because like even if
she, to die, basically.
The whole she's like, "Do you want a tie, mister? Do you want a tie?"
Yeah, she's like in the trenches, literally trying to sell neckties.
That made me think, I don't know why, but that made me think of Les Mis. Like the scene right like when Anne Hathaway is getting her hair like cut off. I don't know why, but I got made like Les Mis just a victim of like the times in it. And I was like, oh my God.
I think additionally, like I guess like maybe like relating to the existentialism point, because like the thing is we as the audience know that she does not end up in Potter's Field. Skip does come and reclaim her body and, you know, like get it sent to like presumably somewhere nicer, but she never gets to find that out. Like Mo herself, like to her knowledge, that's where she's ending up. So even though we know and Skip knows and he sort of like fulfills that final goal for her, the person like who had the goal and who was working towards it never got to see it achieved. So I don't know, like that I think like that's it was still like very sad for me seeing that, because we know but she doesn't know.
I was in the back sobbing. I was in the background and I was just like, oh my God, poor Mo, like tear my mask. It was bad.
Justice for Mo.
Justice for Mo, honestly. And
the real victim of this movie.
Also, so I'm gonna twist this real quick. I think another like political thing that we could talk about, but again, it's from like a modern standpoint, is the feminism in this film, because we see two men and one who she falls in love with beat on poor Candy. Like this girl is getting punched every which way by both of these men, and she's like, she's afraid of Joey, but she's still like, in the beginning she was like kind of still into him, and then at the end she's like in love with Skip, and I'm like, this man punched you like a couple of times.
Beer on you to wake you up.
Literally,
like, on, girl.
And so I don't know what the director's stance is on women's rights or anything like that. Like I couldn't find anything on his stance on domestic violence. But like if this film was made now and then that was showcased, it would be like there would be riots over that. Because
also, wasn't there one scene where does she slap Skip?
Yeah, she like slaps.
Skip? Yeah.
Oh yeah, she like hits him over the head and then
is it different from? Is it the scene where she knocks him out and then goes to the police station, or is it different?
No, they're all like
the one where she like slaps him and then he like beats her up.
And she's like I'm so sorry. But
yeah, and it's interesting.
He doesn't have you, sir. He like went.
It's funny how like when she slaps him, it's like, oh my God, how could you do that? But then like she's constantly getting like beat up.
What I find interesting in relation to that is sort of like what struck me personally is that like, I don't know, maybe I was missing something, or like I'm not remembering something from the other films that we've watched before, but sort of like one thing that struck me personally was watching the scenes where, you know, like Candy gets beaten up on, because I think like, you know, like the worst one was the one in the hotel room when Joe finds out that like a frame is missing from the microfilm and he goes fucking sicko mode.
Yeah, I thought she died there.
Yeah, like and then he shoots her. It's sort of like I was watching that and I was sort of like comparing it to different, you know, like scenes where like, you know, other women in other noirs like get into a scuffle with the male characters, or like when they get, you know, like into the fight, which is very rare. And I was comparing like what we see there to what we see happen to Candy, and what she gets is a lot more brutal and a lot more like intense than what other noir women would get. Because I remember, you know, like we see sort of like in Double Indemnity, like Neff and Phyllis get into like a bit of a scuffle, or like we see like women, yeah, like we see women like manhandled a little bit, but like, you know, at the most they get like shaken.
Yeah.
And I was, you know, like, and that's sort of like the standard that like I was used to so far with noir. And then we see this, and she's like, you know, like she's getting treated exactly like, you know, probably like how a male character would be in a fight scene. And I was just sort of like, you know, like I wasn't like prepared for like the brutality that would have been, that was directed towards her in this film. I think that's just like that definitely says something.
It could also have been a commentary on sex workers, because I think, I don't know, I'm an SVU gal, but I think sex workers were and still are put in positions where they could definitely be victims of violence by men. And so I'm not sure if the director was trying to make a commentary on that, but I think even then and now, having Candy be related to sex workers and like hinted at being a sex worker, and then having like her kind of just accept being victimized in this way, like, you know, just being like, yeah, I'm gonna get hit, and just going with it and like fighting back, but just knowing it's gonna happen. Yeah. And like, I think that is kind of a commentary, at least for me, on sex workers, and just like that's the position they get put in, unfortunately, is because, I mean, it's a dangerous job, and they get put in position all the time where they beaten up on.
But it was
I
also
think,
sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because like I realized I never really, like when I like made that initial point about like, oh, she's hinted to be a sex worker, probably I didn't really like bring up like an like a example to sort of like back that up, even though I had one. It's sort of like, it's again, I think it's that same scene, or like one of the ones where Joe is asking her, Candy, you know, like, how'd you get the film, how'd you get it, and then she tells him, you know, like, how do you think,
yeah,
sort of like implying, you know, like, yeah, you know, and that was sort of, I think that was a scene that kind of like confirmed it for me, of like, oh, okay, so that like they're hinting her to be like a sex worker, right? But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up, so I'm basing it on something.
Yeah, between that and then reading later why the actress got casted as her, and then also just naming Candy, I think those three together kind of lead the audience.
Yeah, I think to Daphne's previous point about how like in the past movies that we've watched, the female character hasn't really been as, I guess, victimized as Candy was. I think it's because this film, I was like, I don't think there's a solid like femme fatale character here, because Candy doesn't really act on her own agency. She's kind of being pushed around by the men in her life, and like she's doing things in accordance to like what their needs are and what they need to have fulfilled. Whereas in past films, it's very much been like the femme fatale is pulling the strings, whereas everyone else is kind of literally pushing Candy around. I guess like Mo's not a femme fatale, but like I think film noir, I feel kind of like, I don't know, I feel not like jaded by the lack of it. It's just kind of like seeing that like victimized damsel in distress character in Candy, but she also has that strength. I think she's kind of like a noir anomaly in kind of a sense.
When I did my usual internet deep dive after watching the film, because I Google everything, I saw her character described as a siren, which I thought was interesting, because I mean, that's a different kind of term we've seen used for female characters in film noir, but also sirens in mythology lead men to their death, and she didn't do that. So I think that's also like an odd use of that word.
She definitely uses like her
kind of
sexuality to like sway situations in her favor, but then again, she's in those situations in order to like get the film for Joey, is his name, Joey, or in order to like protect Skip. It's not like her plan coming to fruition, it's her being a pawn in other people's plans. Like I think when Fuller, like akin to like the capitalist and the communist commentary, with this like kind of feminist, kind of like victimized woman, anti-feminist, if you will, misogynistic commentary, I don't think he set out to like say these things, but he definitely, as the film aged, you saw it, and like this is just like a paramount display of like just kind of the culture of the time. And as
we
like,
take it in context.
Yeah, and then like as it's aged, you kind of like see this, like the people watching it then was like, oh yeah, this is just like, this is how 1950s Red Scare life is. And now that we're watching it, we're like, whoa, this is an anti-capitalistic, you know, misogynistic movie about, you know.
Yeah, I think it shows the generations, because also I know a lot of people now like around our age that I just identify as communists. It's like they're like, yeah, which you would never
especially
say.
on college campuses. Come on.
Yeah. And
Literally.
it was sitting on my desk.
There's so oh, Grimes. Just
Here's my prop cue. Here it is. There's my
walking
prop
around
cue.
with Karl Marx. But yeah, like I know people who are like, I'm a communist, and I'm like, okay, sure. That's hard, but like you would never say that out loud and brag about it at the time the film came out, or like decades later. You would still like, you in the 80s, you wouldn't say I'm a communist. They'd be like,
yeah, and it's sort of like, because I think specifically like when we see all the scenes, you know, like with Joey, sort of like whenever he's talking about, you know, like, oh, I need the film for this, you know, like this is why we need it. We always see like this very visible stress on him, like literally like visible sweat droplets like coming down. He's like shaking, like with like how anxious he is. Yeah, and sort of like because he's so nervous about this like being found out, of like even it like leaking like beyond him to Candy, because it's sort of, you're like, oh, if she knows, that like who else could know, you know, like the police could find out all of this, all of that. It's sort of like this very present anxiety of like, what if, you know, like the wrong people find out, and then, you know, like and then everything's like gone to shit because of it.
Yeah, I think that's just like this whole, like, Candy didn't even know he was like a communist spy, literally. Like that whole, I guess, McCarthyism thing that was going on in the 1950s after World War II. It was like, communists look like everybody else. Like you never know who might be a communist. I think that's kind of like present there, and like just like Joey's existence. But he's also like hesitant to violence, kind of. Like he picks up the gun, but then again he's like, I don't know, like he's kind of, I guess, if I'm thinking of a film at this time and you would have told me to like conceptualize like a communist propaganda film from the 1950s, I would be like, oh yeah, they'd be so demonized, and they would be like, you know, these like really outlandish characters, but like they were just kind of like antagonists. They like, I don't think they were anything super insane besides the fact that they had that label of like red or commie.
I think it is interesting how he's like, to me, he came across portrayed as like very cowardly, like even, you know, like we've got the anxiety scenes, but then also, you know, like I remember that scene in sort of like the final shootout where, you know, like he gets the gun, he's waiting for the police, you know, like literally in the dumbwaiter, and then he gets out, you know, like he ambushes the guy. He doesn't really go in for a straight fight. He always, you know, like he goes and he assaults the woman, and then when the police come, when the men come, he hides in the dumbwaiter and, you know, like, and jumps out when they're not expecting it.
Yeah, I think this like film as a whole was just like very like, you know, paranoia of the time. Like not like femme fatales were like products of paranoia, and then now you have this like this whole communist plot line was like products of paranoia. Like I think that's like a very big thing in film noir. It's just like things arising based on like, of course, the effects of World War II, but then this kind of like innate like worry about like the outside world and this disillusionment with the country that they were living in, this kind of like skepticism.
I think like ultimately it's very like there's a lot of implicit politics in here.
To look at it, it's looking at it from then, looking at it from now, because the audience looked at it with a different sense, and we're like, and us as an audience when like it came out, and then us as the audience now, we're looking at it with like what we know now from the Red Scare, with it being like kind of in the past, and kind of because I don't know if people are so afraid of communists or not, and
well, some people definitely.
I think my father's terrified of them, but that's on him. And like, so like there's two different ways to look at it for us as like our generation watching this film, but also with us having been studying film noir, and to look at it from like how it comes from a film noir perspective.
Yeah, I think even if he didn't, Elena, I think she was frozen a little bit there.
Oh, okay.
I just thought I was scared for a minute. Whoops.
Yeah, hopefully she comes back. But yeah, even if Fuller didn't
something happened to my connection.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Wait, do we want to do one last trivia or?
Sorry.
Oh yeah, I'll throw in the last trivia. Okay. Fun fact: Marilyn Monroe read for the character of Candy. Imagine. Sorry. Just imagine.
Imagine if she was casted. I think Fuller actually didn't cast her because he said that he didn't like her sensuality. She like wasn't good for it. She was like very innocent.
What did it say? It says
So she didn't have enough, or
I don't know. I remember reading something about
glamorous. Marilyn Monroe, Shelley Winters, and Ava Gardner all looked too glamorous, and Betty Gable wanted a dance number, so he was like, no. Then
I don't think a dance number would be
no fucking dancing.
He was like, sorry, Betty. And then Jean Peters, he was like, you walk like a sex worker. You shall be cast.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I think, overall, Fuller may have not set out to make a political movie. Oh, Elena's coming back. There she is. But it was definitely politically charged. So, yeah, unless anyone has any further comments to make on Pickup on South Street, I'll see you guys next week.
Yep.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.